I walked into the house expecting the usual chaos or at least some kind of noise. But that evening the silence was thick, almost oppressive, like the calm before a storm. I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. My wife, Emily, wasn't in the kitchen where she usually waited to greet me with the rundown of her day. No clattering of pots, no footsteps upstairs, just pure, unsettling silence. I stood there for a second letting it sink in and felt a knot form in my stomach. After a long day all I wanted was to relax, maybe crack open a beer, sit on the couch and let the stress melt away. But something felt off. I don't know what drew me upstairs. Maybe instinct, maybe some buried suspicion I didn't even know I had. I moved slowly, my footsteps muffled by the carpet, and made my way up. The closer I got to our bedroom the heavier the air seemed to get until it was almost choking. Then I heard it, a soft, muffled groan that sliced right through the quiet. For a split second I wanted to believe it was my imagination, a trick my tired mind was playing on me. But there it was again, and this time louder. I stood there frozen, my mind battling between rage and disbelief. My heart hammered so hard I thought it would give me away. But I stayed silent, every muscle locked as I took one last step toward the slightly open door, holding my breath. Through the crack in the door I caught a reflection in the mirror on the opposite wall. There she was, my wife of 7 years, lying beneath someone else in our bed. And not just anyone, she was with Greg, my best friend. The guy who'd been there through thick and thin, the one who stood by my side at our wedding smiling, toasting to our future. Watching them I felt something snap inside. I wanted to storm in, tear them apart, scream, demand answers for why they'd betrayed me in such a gut-wrenching way. But I stopped myself. That would have been too easy, too satisfying for them. Instead I took a step back, one slow silent step after another, slipping back down the stairs and out the front door, making sure it closed with the same quiet I'd come in with. As I walked to my car the first drops of rain started to fall, and the storm outside mirrored the one boiling inside me. The image of them together burned in my mind, searing every nerve with raw anger. Greg, the man I'd trusted more than anyone, and Emily, the woman I'd loved with everything I had, both lying to my face. They thought they'd gotten away with it, convinced I was oblivious. But I wasn't going to let them off that easy. I drove aimlessly that night, my grip on the wheel turning my knuckles white. The rain poured down and I welcomed it. The drumming of raindrops on the roof kept me grounded as I wrestled with the betrayal clawing at my insides. My mind raced through a million ideas of revenge, but it all felt too chaotic. I didn't want to burst in, fists flying, and end up looking like the fool they thought I was. No, I wanted something more. Something that would cut deeper, last longer. By the time I got home I had a plan, a slow, cold one. The anger, the heartbreak, I would use it all to my advantage. I would act like nothing had changed, like I had no idea. They would continue with their little game, thinking they had outsmarted me. And while they enjoyed their secret moments, I'd be right here watching, waiting for the perfect moment to pull the rug out from under them. The next morning I woke up early and made breakfast, slipping back into my usual routine as if nothing had happened. Emily came downstairs, her usual cheerful self, asking if I'd had a good night. I had to force myself not to laugh. The audacity. She looked me right in the eyes, so sure I was clueless. As she talked about her plans for the day I pretended to listen, but I couldn't stop picturing her with him. And Greg, my so-called best friend. I knew he'd play it cool too, act like everything was fine the next time we hung out, maybe even slap me on the back like we were still as close as brothers. But brothers don't do what he did. Later that day I texted Greg's wife, Claire. We'd been friends for years, she was like family. And if Greg thought he could throw me under the bus, I wasn't about to let him keep his nice, cozy life intact. My message was casual, nothing that would raise suspicion, just a simple "hey, been a while. Wanna grab coffee and catch up?" She replied within minutes, probably thinking nothing of it. Claire and I met up that afternoon at a quiet cafe. I kept things light, talking about life, work, and the usual small talk. But as we chatted I could see she was struggling, like she had something weighing on her. "How's Greg?" I asked finally, careful to keep my tone casual. She paused, looking away for a moment. He's been distant, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know, things have just felt off lately. My heart twisted, both from pity and from the grim satisfaction that my suspicions were right. Claire had noticed it too. I leaned in, my expression full of concern. I'm sorry to hear that, Claire. You deserve better. Really you do. She smiled weakly, and for a moment, I saw just how lonely she was. Greg had neglected her, let her feel isolated while he indulged himself with my wife. I wasn't going to just expose him. I wanted to take everything he had piece by piece. Over the next week I kept up the charade, playing the role of the clueless husband with Emily and the oblivious friend with Greg. I went to work, came home, and pretended I was just as oblivious as I'd always been. Meanwhile I started planting seeds with Claire. I listened to her, validated her, became her confidant. Every message, every call, every innocent cup of coffee added to my plan. I wanted her to see me as the man Greg could never be. It didn't take long before she was reaching out to me more often. She'd send a message asking if I wanted to meet up. A few times I'd find an excuse to casually bump into her, and each time she opened up a little more. I was becoming her support, her escape, and I knew Greg had no idea. After a couple of weeks I decided it was time to push things further. One evening when Emily was out I called Claire and asked if she wanted to meet. She sounded relieved, like she'd been waiting for me to ask. We met at a secluded spot, and I could tell she was nervous, her eyes darting around, her hands fidgeting. But I put her at ease, listening as she poured her heart out about how lost she felt, how she thought she'd done something wrong, how Greg barely seemed to notice her anymore. It's not your fault, Claire, I said softly, leaning in just enough to let my words linger. You deserve someone who really sees you. Her eyes met mine, and in that moment I knew I had her. This was going to be my revenge. As I drove home that night, I felt a twisted thrill beneath the steady rage I'd been carrying. The pieces were falling into place just as I'd planned. Claire was opening up to me, leaning on me in ways she should have been leaning on Greg. Each time she shared her hurt and frustration, I knew I was making progress. And best of all, neither Greg nor Emily suspected a thing. They were probably feeling comfortable thinking they had gotten away with it. But that was exactly what I wanted. The next day I kept up my usual routine with Emily, still playing the role of the unsuspecting husband. She was the picture of sweetness, chattering away as she packed lunches, talking about her plans for the weekend. She was texting more than usual, probably arranging yet another secret meeting with Greg. I let her believe I was none the wiser, nodding along, holding back the disgust that simmered every time I looked at her. Meanwhile, Claire had started reaching out to me daily. She would send a quick message here and there, something small, but the meaning was unmistakable. She felt alone and she felt misunderstood. And I, of course, was there to listen, to understand her in ways Greg never did. Each time we met she opened up more, almost desperate for connection. Her loneliness had made her vulnerable and I was capitalizing on it. It was a slow burn, but every careful, calculated step was bringing her closer to me, and further from Greg. One Friday evening I decided to take things a step further. I knew Greg would be out late, probably with Emily. I texted Claire, inviting her to a quiet bar near her place, and she accepted right away. When I walked in she was already there, nursing a glass of wine, her eyes lighting up when she saw me. I sat down beside her, ordered a drink, and we fell into conversation. I didn't even have to bring up Greg, she did it herself, almost immediately. I just don't know who he is anymore, she sighed, staring into her glass. It's like I don't even matter to him. I reached out, putting my hand on hers. You matter, Claire, I said softly. You matter more than he'll ever know. She looked up, her expression softening as she held my gaze. Thank you, really? I don't know what I'd do without you, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. I leaned in slightly, letting the silence linger just long enough to build the tension. And then carefully, I let my hand linger on hers a bit longer, allowing her to feel the warmth of my touch. She didn't pull away. In fact, she leaned in just a little closer, her face inches from mine. The air between us felt charged, like we were both teetering on the edge of something inevitable. But I didn't make the final move. Not yet. Instead, I pulled back, giving her a small understanding smile, just enough to keep her wanting more. I could see the frustration in her eyes, the longing. She was hooked and she didn't even know it. As we walked out of the bar, she lingered, almost as if she was waiting for me to invite her back to my place. I gave her a gentle hug, letting it last just a little longer than usual, and whispered, "Good night, Claire. I'll see you soon." She drove off, leaving me there in the parking lot, watching her car disappear around the corner. I knew she'd be thinking about me all night. The seed was firmly planted now, and I just had to let it grow. The next morning, Emily was her usual cheerful self, acting as if everything was perfectly normal. She kissed me on the cheek, oblivious to the storm brewing right beneath her nose. I smiled back, feeling a surge of satisfaction, knowing I was a few steps ahead. It was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down on her and Greg, leaving them in ruins. But I wasn't rushing. No, this was going to be a slow burn, one that they'd never see coming. I wasn't just taking revenge. I was rewriting the narrative, turning them into the fools they'd tried to make me. And when it was over, they'd be left wondering how it all unraveled so perfectly, while I'd be walking away free of the weight they'd tried to bury me under. It was about 2 weeks after that evening with Claire when I knew it was time to escalate my plan. Greg's arrogance had reached new heights. He was practically parading around as if his secret affair with my wife was some twisted achievement. And Emily? She continued to act like the perfect wife, showering me with affection that felt more like salt in an open wound. But I wasn't going to explode. That's what they'd expect, what they'd laugh about together behind my back. No, I was going to make sure that my revenge ran deeper than anything they could have imagined. I kept my interactions with Claire steady, never pushing too far, too fast. I wanted her to feel the comfort of a friendship that was slowly blossoming into something more. She had started opening up about things she'd never shared with Greg, like her love for painting, something he'd always dismissed as a waste of time. I encouraged her, admired her work, and let her know she was appreciated. She began to bloom in ways she hadn't in years, and it was clear she was seeing me in a different light. I could see it in her smile, in the way she leaned closer each time we met. One evening, I invited her over for dinner at my place, under the pretense that I'd made a little too much food and could use the company. She hesitated at first but eventually agreed. When she arrived, I greeted her with a casual warmth, and she seemed more at ease than I'd ever seen her. We ate, laughed, shared stories, and soon it felt like we were the only two people in the world. After dinner we sat on the couch, the silence stretching between us in a way that felt heavier than any words could. She looked at me, and in that moment I knew she wanted me to make a move. But I held back, letting her close the distance herself. When she finally leaned in, pressing her lips softly against mine, it felt like victory. It wasn't just about the kiss, it was the knowledge that Greg's world was about to start unraveling, one thread at a time. When we pulled apart, her face was flushed, her eyes filled with guilt and confusion. I shouldn't have done that, she stammered. I took her hands, my expression serious. Claire, you deserve someone who sees you, who values you. Don't feel guilty for wanting that. She nodded, but I could see the war waging in her mind. I didn't press further. I knew the seed was already there, and now I just had to let it grow. The next day, Emily was her usual cheerful self, texting and calling with the same rehearsed sweetness, probably thinking she was in control. But that evening I decided to shake things up. I knew Greg would be working late, code for being with my wife, so I sent Claire a message, "Feel like meeting up for a drink? I'd love to see you." Her reply was almost instant. "Yes, I'd like that. Where should we meet?" We chose a cozy, dimly lit bar where no one we knew would notice us. She walked in looking a little nervous, but her face lit up when she saw me. We spent hours talking, just the two of us, and by the end of the night, it was clear she'd crossed a line in her mind. She didn't pull away when I reached for her hand, didn't hesitate when I leaned in and kissed her again, this time deeper, more certain. In that moment she was mine. She didn't say it, but I knew. When we finally left, I saw the satisfaction in her eyes, the same satisfaction I felt. It was more than revenge, it was watching Greg's life begin to crumble brick by brick. That weekend I knew Greg would be taking Emily on a business trip, so I invited Claire to spend the day with me. We went to a quiet spot by the lake, walked, talked, and let the hours drift by as if we didn't have a care in the world. She confided in me about her frustrations with Greg, her doubts about their marriage, her worries that she was being taken for granted. I listened, sympathized, and encouraged her to see that she deserved so much more. As the sun started to set, she looked over at me, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, for everything," she murmured, and then she kissed me, a lingering kiss that carried with it a sense of relief and longing. I knew then that she was falling for me, that she was as invested in this as I was. But for me this wasn't about love or a new beginning. This was about revenge, and it was almost time to make sure Greg knew exactly what he'd lost. As Claire drove away that evening, a final piece of my plan began to take shape. I was going to make sure they all knew. Emily, Greg, Claire, they were all going to see exactly what their actions had set in motion. And by the time they realized, it would be too late. The following week, everything fell into place. Greg and Emily had gotten cocky. They were getting comfortable, believing their little affair was safely hidden, just a secret between the two of them. Meanwhile, Claire was slipping further into my grasp, texting me daily, opening up in ways she'd never done with Greg. I knew she felt torn, but she was also drawn to me, feeling seen and appreciated in ways her husband had failed to provide. And that was exactly what I wanted. It was a Thursday evening when I decided to set the final stage. Greg had mentioned he'd be working late again, a predictable excuse at this point. Emily of course had plans with a friend, both of them were so bold, so sure that I was clueless. But tonight they were going to experience a very rude awakening. I sent Claire a message that evening, something simple: "I know it's last minute, but would you want to come over? I could really use the company." She replied almost immediately, "I'd love to." She arrived not long after, and this time, there was no hesitation when she walked through the door. She looked at me, a little nervous but more certain than I'd ever seen her. She dressed up, wearing something understated but elegant, a look that told me she'd put thought into this, that she wanted to make a good impression. We settled and had a couple of drinks, and as we sat on the couch, it felt like the air between us was electric. "I've never done anything like this," she admitted softly, looking down as if she were ashamed. I lifted her chin gently, meeting her gaze. "You deserve to be happy, Claire. Don't let anyone make you feel guilty for that." She smiled, a flicker of relief crossing her face, and then she leaned in, kissing me with a hunger that was all the confirmation I needed. But as the night wore on, I felt a thrill that had nothing to do with passion and everything to do with what was coming next. Claire was in my arms and Greg was nowhere near aware of what he was about to lose. After a while, as the night started winding down, I suggested we take a quick photo together. Claire seemed hesitant at first, but then laughing she leaned in close, her arm around my shoulder. I took a couple of photos, ones that looked perfectly innocent on the surface but held an intimacy that was undeniable. She looked at them, smiling, and for a moment I could see she felt happy. She kissed me one last time before heading out, whispering a soft goodbye that felt final but sweet. Little did she know, this was about to turn her entire life upside down. The next day I took those photos and saved them carefully. They were just subtle enough that Claire wouldn't be humiliated, but clear enough to get my point across. I printed a few copies and slipped them into envelopes, one labeled for Emily and one for Greg, which I sent to his office. I made sure they'd both receive them around the same time. I wanted them to feel the shock, the sting of betrayal, as close to each other as possible. When I returned home that evening, Emily was waiting for me, looking pale and shaken, clutching the envelope I'd sent her. Her eyes were wide, her face a mix of confusion and horror, as if the very ground beneath her had shifted. What is this?" she stammered, holding up the photo with trembling hands. How could you?" I raised an eyebrow, keeping my expression calm and cold. Funny, I was going to ask you the same thing. The color drained from her face, and for a moment she looked utterly lost, as if she hadn't fully processed what was happening. I don't understand. What? Don't bother lying, I cut in, my voice steady but sharp. I know everything. You and Greg sneaking around behind my back like I'm some kind of idiot. I've known for a while now, Emily. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. I could see her struggling to come up with an excuse, a justification, anything that could make this look less horrific than it was. But there was nothing she could say that would undo the damage she'd done. And then, as if on cue, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Claire. It's over, the text read. Greg just called me. He knows. I can't believe this is happening. I'm so sorry. I could almost feel the panic in her words, the shock of her carefully guarded life collapse in a single brutal moment. Greg's world was crumbling right alongside Emily's, and that knowledge filled me with a dark satisfaction. Emily stumbled back, sinking onto the couch, her hand covering her mouth as if she was going to be sick. How could you do this to me? She finally choked out, her voice small broken. How could I do this? I repeated, barely able to contain the bitter laugh that rose in my throat. You're asking me that after everything you did? For once she had no comeback, no deflection. Just the hollow silence of someone who knew they'd lost. It was the sound of defeat. As I turned to leave, Emily called out, her voice shaking. What happens now? I paused at the door, looking back at her with a cool indifference that felt foreign even to me. That's up to you, Emily. But don't expect forgiveness. Not from me. I walked out, shutting the door behind me, letting the weight of her betrayal fade with every step. I walked out of that house, letting the finality of the moment sink in. The air felt cleaner, somehow lighter, as if all the weight of their lies, the betrayal, had been peeled off. Emily's stunned silence, her tear-streaked face, it was everything I had been waiting for. But I wasn't finished just yet. There was still one more message to send, one final nail in the coffin. Greg had called me earlier just as I knew he would. After he'd found the photo of me and Claire, he was furious, his voice shaking with rage. He demanded answers, threw out accusations, tried to make me feel guilty. I let him rant, enjoying every second of his unraveling. When he finally stopped to catch his breath, I spoke in a calm, almost amused tone. Funny, isn't it? I said, keeping my voice steady. You thought you could take everything from me, my wife, my trust, and not pay the price. But here we are. He fell silent on the other end, realizing he'd walked right into my trap. I could practically hear his mind scrambling to piece it all together, and I let him sit in that silence, letting the weight of his actions settle in. You took Emily from me, I continued, my voice hardening, so I took Claire from you. And believe me, it wasn't difficult. She's been lonely for a long time, Greg, because you were too busy sneaking around to notice. The only difference between us is that I did it right in front of you, and you never saw it coming. There was a beat of silence, and then a quiet, defeated exhale on the other end. So, what now? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. I could hear the fear, the resignation, and I knew I'd gotten to him. Now? I said with a cold laugh. Now you get to live with it just like I had to. Only difference is, I had the decency not to betray my best friend first. With that, I hung up, leaving him in his misery, fully aware that his life would never be the same. Claire would leave him eventually, she was a good woman and she deserved better. And now, with the truth out in the open, she would see the kind of man Greg truly was. Back at the house, Emily tried reaching out over the next few days, sending texts, leaving voicemails, each one more desperate than the last. She begged for forgiveness, pleaded with me to come back, claimed it was all a mistake, as if her months of deceit could be dismissed with a single word. I deleted every message, each one less significant than the last. The Emily I had loved, the woman I'd married, no longer existed. She had destroyed that with every lie she'd told, every stolen moment she'd shared with Greg. I threw myself into work, focused on rebuilding my life. It wasn't easy, but each day felt like another step forward, another piece of myself reclaimed from the wreckage of their betrayal. Friends and family eventually noticed the absence of Emily, asked gentle questions that I brushed off with a casual "things didn't work out." I wasn't about to give her the satisfaction of becoming the topic of gossip. She was a ghost now, and I intended to keep it that way. A few weeks later I ran into Claire. She looked different, tired but stronger, like someone who'd faced a storm and come out on the other side. She walked over, tentative but determined. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, her eyes full of guilt and regret. "For everything. I didn't know." I gave her a small nod, letting her know there was no bad blood between us. "You don't owe me an apology, Claire. You were hurt and so was I. They did this to us. Not you." She smiled, a sad but genuine smile. We stood there in silence for a moment, two people bound by a shared betrayal but now free to move on. She thanked me, then turned and walked away, her shoulders a little straighter, her steps a little lighter. Life moved on. Emily and Greg had faded into a distant memory, reduced to nothing more than lessons learned, scars healed. They would live with the choices they'd made, and I'd continue to live with the satisfaction of knowing that I had risen above their lies, refusing to be dragged down by their betrayal. One evening as I sat alone watching the sunset from my back porch, I felt a strange, unexpected peace. I'd survived the storm, emerged stronger, and found a new sense of clarity, of purpose. I wasn't the same man I'd been, and that was a good thing. The pain, the rage, it had all served its purpose, shaping me into someone more resilient, someone who knew his own worth. In the end, I'd taken back control of my life. And that, more than any act of revenge, was the ultimate victory.